This is the Florida Horse Podcast, presented by the Florida Thoroughbred Breeders and Owners Association. In this episode, we're rejoined once again by FTBOA's Tammy Gantt and Brent and Fernung of Journeyman Stud as they continue the conversation about the Florida Sire Stakes.
So when you talk about the history, I know there's some horses that have been in the Florida Sire Stakes that we each may have a little bit of a favorite or a story behind. So I have one, it's Unbridled. I'm not going to lie. He's my boy. I look for any of his grandson's sons, any horses running in the Breeders' Cup, because I think he's had such a powerful influence as a Florida bred, as a racehorse, and then, in his career producing some outstanding champions. And so he stands out in my mind, but I know you have a couple of Sire Stakes horses that stand out in your mind.
I got a story about that. Fred Bry was at the farm one day, and Jackson Ben had just swept Stallion Stakes, I believe it still was at that time, the previous year, and it was about the 1st of April, and he was out at the farm, and he says, I got a 2-year-old filly that can outrun Jackson Ben right now. I said, sure you do, Fred. And the filly turned out to be an awesome feather. And so that was a great story. Fred had already identified her as the successor to Jackson Ben. Of course, she was undefeated when she won the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies.
Yeah, because she swept the Sire Stakes, went to the Breeders' Cup Juvenile Fillies. I happened to be there. It was an incredible moment for Florida because Big Drama won that year also. Mm-hmm. And then I believe Zenyatta was the closing act who didn't quite beat Blame. It was the best race I've ever seen a horse actually lose because Zenyatta was so amazing. But to have, Big Drama and Awesome Feather on that same card. And then the next day, Awesome Feather is in the sale the next day. And she was just such a tiny filly. And I looked, I go, I can't believe that filly just won the Breeders' Cup yesterday. It was incredible.
Yeah. And of course, we bred Princess Secret, who won 2/3 of the Sire Stakes races when the Susan's Girl and the My Dear Girl as her 2-year-old year. That was a big thrill to us. We still have her mother at home, and she's got a full brother to Princess Secret.
Really? You still have her mother?
Right now. Mm-hmm. She's
Wow.
in foal to our new horse, Uncle Chuck.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. And that legacy continues. Yeah. So some of the horses that you've performed well in the Sire Stakes, you now have as brood mares or the daughters of ones that have performed.
We have both the mare and her daughter at home, the filly JP's Delight, who won the Marion County Stakes at Tampa. We happened to be fortunate enough to own her at that time. It was kind of like misfortune turning into fortune because she had a chip in her knee as a 2-year-old, so I couldn't sell her. And later on, when we got her to the racetrack, she was just incredibly fast, and we beat Wildwood's Beauty winning the Marion County Stakes. And so that was exciting. We have her dam at home, too, who's currently in foal to Cozon, has a St. Patrick's Day colt by her side. She is in foal to Uncle Chuck, JP is, and she's got a Cozon filly by her side. So it's all kind of wraps around, works together.
So you're moving into your next generation of horses. And it's interesting you say the Marion County Stakes, and there's the City of Ocala Stakes. I don't know if all the folks in our county even realize there's stakes named after our county and our city. Mm-hmm. So I know a few do because we've taken a bus trip with the community and business leaders over there, and that's been great fun. So, Crystal, is there anything that you want to add as far as the Florida Sire Stakes and the importance of people, nominating those horses for it, or just, part of that history that means a lot to you?
Well, I think as far as the nomination process, you guys do such a great job of sending out reminders, and, that's because you all get busy, that time of year, and things can slip by you. So FTBOA has always done a really great job of, if you need a reminder, if you're paying any attention at all, there's reminders everywhere to pay those. And I know we'll go back through, when the yearling payment comes, if we've sold any, follow up, with people that's bought them, make sure that they know as well, because if you're going to breed Florida breds, it's just makes no sense to not have them registered for that stake, that stake series, because it's just like the pinnacle of what being a Florida bred is all about, is having the opportunity for those kind of races at your disposal. And then when you're at the sale and they come by with that little sheet that you guys have with all the, and they want to see horses that are registered for the Florida Sire Stakes, I think that says it all.
Yeah, I've noticed I get a lot more calls around the sales confirming if a horse is the Florida Sire Stakes eligible. And we do produce that sheet at the sales, which I'm glad to hear you consigning horses see that sheet go around, because we actually have people make those decisions on their short list based on, is the horse Sire Stakes eligible or not. And so, and you brought up a good point. So we have a May 15th yearling deadline, but the sales happen after that, a lot of them. And so what happens if you had a horse on a June sale, you know, that's nice that you follow up and check that. But we also have that November 15th deadline for that purpose. So there's only 2 payments, May 15th and January 15th, and then some secondary ones if people miss it, which is really important. I know at Calder there were 4 payments. It was the full, it was the yearling, and then there was two 2-year-old ones. And so it took about 3 years for people to realize, no, we don't have 4, we just have 2, and we try to make it so it works if you're selling those horses and not breeding to race. So you have a pretty good point there, because I've seen that increase, and we've actually increased the number of Florida breds in the full crop over the decades since we began this program under the auspices of FTBOA. We've actually seen a steady increase in the percentage of horses of the full crop that are FSS eligible, and that hovers, you know, it's more than 60%. It's been as high as 69% of the full crop. So that just tells you that extra benefit it is to breed a Florida bred, but also, you know, breed it to have a Florida sire, which is one of the criteria to make sure you breed to a FTBOA registered Florida sire.
Well, like Crystal said, when people come by at the yearling sale or at the 2-year-old sales, they see these horses and they want to make sure that they're eligible for the sire stakes. I mean, it only makes sense. You give $50,000 for a horse, and potentially 4 or 5 months later you could be running in a $400,000 race. And, you know, bang for your buck, you compare it to nominating to the Breeders' Cup, it's just a whole lot more likely that lightning will strike in the FSS races for you.
Yeah, and as breeders, we want to make sure that, you know, that's why we follow up, because if we find 1 or 2 that maybe has forgotten or they've fallen off, you know, off the chart for them for some reason, you sure don't want to see that horse win and know that you didn't follow up and do everything that you could as a breeder, because, you know, you have the breeders awards that come along with it, and the stallion awards that come along with it, and you want definitely as a breeder to make sure that those horses are fully nominated.
Yeah, I track down phone numbers and I text people and say, you bought hip so and so.
Surprise! You you can win 400,000.
You need to make your payment to the Florida Sire Stakes, and they'll liable to text back, thanks. Who is this?
And then they're like, wait, you just helped me out. So when they're in the winner's circle, hopefully they remember that, and you get that nice steak dinner at one of those nice restaurants at Gulfstream Park.
I'd settle for the Stallion Award.
There we go. Yeah, well, yeah, that Stallion Award, of course. What's interesting too is not only, you know, is it's the prestige. A lot of it is the prestige of having those champions, and then also the prep for the Breeders' Cup in that series. But also on the other side of it, the bettors really love the Florida Sire Stakes. It's very well received. It's been some of the biggest days for Gulfstream Park, which is amazing when you say it's an August, you know, September series, yet the crowds love it because it's very competitive. They really like to analyze the 2-year-olds that are there and where they might finish in those races. So I think that's a benefit too, because when you have a large field of wonderful horses going to post, but then at the end of the day, the racetrack can say, hey, we had a lot of people interested in looking at those horses. I think that also gets us new owners in the business, because if they're watching this, you know, somewhere else in the country, they're saying, wow, these horses are really competing.
Well, you would think from the horseman standpoint and from the racetrack standpoint that they would love it as well, because if you check out their summer racing, inevitably, with the possibility of the Summit of Speed, their 3 best days are going to be those Florida Sire Stakes days.
Yeah, and they have. They've surpassed even some others, and they keep growing. It's each year we hear, oh, it's another record, and you see the year before's record, and you say, wow, that was unbelievable, and now we're hitting that number. And so I think the handle's really important. So for those that don't realize, the handle generates that those funds that help fund the Breeders' Awards. So the more competitive the races are, which a lot of Florida breds are. I mean, the number of races Florida breds win in the Gulfstream Championship meet in the summer are significant. And then the number of those horses that win that are sired by Florida Stallions is significant. And I think that's a stat sometimes people don't always see. It gets lost in the shuffle. But if you follow horse racing at Gulfstream Park in the championship meet in the summer, you'll start to see that.
Without question, I kind of do a little tracking on my own. I'll go through and check out how many Florida breds. I'll pick an odd day and see how many Florida breds are running at Gulfstream that day. And the interesting thing is you'll see a maiden special weight race for 2-year-old fillies. It's a state bred race, which I love. I'm glad that they're doing those. But when you look at the race, and then the next week they come back with the same race in open company and say, wow, that race for Florida breds come up tougher than the maiden special weight open did. And so, I think that we're more than competitive down there. In the wintertime, we're competitive, and in the summertime, we dominate.
Yeah, and I think, too, I didn't mention that you're on the FTBOA Board of Directors. You're a past president and a former first lady of FTBOA, as we will. And I think that one of the things you brought to the table is that I was always impressed because you would pull out the statistics saying, one day I tracked this and I saw this, and you come to the table well armed with information. So that helps you in all the decisions you make. And that's why I think you've had such a successful business for so many years. But I also know that you didn't start at the pinnacle here. You started as grooms. And so you want to talk a little bit about your journey because I think some people see those that are in the industry today and don't know if they can attain that. So if they hear folks' backstory, then they realize, okay, they weren't an overnight success. They put in a lot of sweat equity and work to get there.
We came here in 1976 and left Indiana without a college education and not much prospects for anything. Got down here and got a job making $130 a week, working 6.5 days. And Crystal got a job as a receptionist, and she made less money than I did. And we started working at it. And I started watching these, what was going on around me. And I said, there's got to be a better way of doing this rather than just mucking stalls for a living. And so I learned everything I could about a horse. And by 1980, I became the broodmare manager by default at Lassiter Farm. By default meaning that Blackie Huffman, the previous broodmare manager, decided he wanted to go back to training horses. He moved back to Kentucky, and they couldn't find anybody to take his place at that time. And so after about 6 months, I said, things are going pretty good with me running it. So needless to say, we did start from the ground floor and went out on our own. What was it? 1989.
He's leaving out a key element that he pinhooked goats before that. So he had some pinhooking ability already in him with those goats.
Yes.
Yeah, that was tricky. Buy them goats for $3, and then when they have a baby, take them back because the babies are so cute. They'd sell for $25, $30 just on emotion. I was 11 or 12 years old, so I thought
So you were well prepared for this industry. So I didn't mean to cut you off. Continue. We were up to 1989. You were saying,
Yeah, 89.
Yeah, 1989 we went out on our own. We came up with the name Journeyman Bloodstock a few years earlier because I was starting to buy a few horses on my own, or with Johnny Mack Smith, one of the founders of Peterson and Smith. And so I said, the only goal I ever had here was to be a good journeyman horseman, somebody who knows how to do his job. So we'll just we'll buy horses under Journeyman Bloodstock. And so we didn't realize it was going to become a full-time venture. But in 1989, there wasn't enough jobs around. I lost my job as farm manager where I was, and we started out getting some resumes made and was worrying about having to move to Kentucky and just started trying to sell horses for people, and it just kind of stumbled along, and we did pretty well, or kept the lights on anyways. And then a mare came up for sale, and her name was Eileen's Moment. And I'd had her 2-year-old the year before for a short while. He was a horse named Lily T. So when she came up for sale, we went ahead and bought her. And 2 months later, Lily T won the Kentucky Derby. And that was a big asset to us.
Yeah, that day especially, because we had a filly in training that we were pricing to somebody for $35,000, and they came to OBS to look at her. We breezed her. Everything was great. I went back to our farm because the blacksmith was coming, so I was going over there. Brent stayed with the groom to make sure she cooled out, and he's like, okay, she's good enough. Put her on the hot walker, and then put her back in the stall. She fell, broke her femur, lost the sale. So we come home, take showers, get ready to go in and watch the Derby, and we're sitting there with our daughter, who's like, what's she been, 12?
92.
And so we're just sitting there, and Brent's like, oh, if he could just hit the board, this would be great. And then that was the year Rozzy was, all the talk. So they're coming out around the club.
And AP Indy.
Yeah, and they're coming out of the clubhouse turn, and, they're calling Rozzy's doing this, and Brent jumps up and he says, forget about Rozzy, here comes this big shadow roll, because they ran him in a great big shadow roll. And so we're, jumping up and down and hollering and carrying on, and, it was crazy. Years and years later, we're at Breeders' Cup with Fred Bry, and sitting at the table next to us is Pat Day, who had been riding Lily T that day. The second day of the Breeders' Cup, such a nice guy, he comes over and introduces himself, because I didn't go over. People had been talking to him the whole time. So I told him that we had this, that was your Derby and this was our day. And so then he started telling me his story of that day. And it just kind of made it, so complete, that whole, how a horse can have that much impact on so many different people.
Yeah, and it starts out where, you say it was a devastating thing for you to have a horse that might sell for $35,000, and you're down in the dumps, but yet somehow by the blessings, the horse racing world's crazy like that, right? All of a sudden now you can be on top of the world because a horse you had a connection with, Lily T, wins a Kentucky Derby. And then, like you said, the story of Pat behind it is just very inspiring. And I think that's the tale of horse racing, right? People breed horses. It's the riskiest part of the business, but they don't necessarily breed them for the money. They breed them for the idea that one day that horse will be in a race and be a champion. And yes, the financial part's there, but there's a lot more to it, I think, than that, because when you see a horse that you believe in and they do something, there's like something in your psyche that changes. It's just very, very heartwarming.
Well, we'll watch races at home, and we'll have a horse that we bred will be running, and it could be a cheap horse, a $5,000 claimer, but if it turns for home and he's making a run at the leaders, we're up and jumping and yelling, and like
dogs are barking.
The dogs are barking.
And are you like doing the snap
yeah.
with your finger?
The
snap with your finger,
yeah.
and like you're riding him down the last quarter mile. It's like, come on, and you're as tired as the jockey at the end.
But anybody that's ever owned a racehorse and won a race with him recognizes that feeling.
For me, it's one of the great reasons to own stallions for us. You can breed horses and you can cheer them down but when you're the owner of the stallion, everything that's by your stallion that's the way we do. We're cheering, as hard for them as what we would if it was our own horse, because, it's a culmination of 5 years really to make a stallion, find out, what their potential is, how much success they're going to have. So you've put a lot of years into getting to that place where you can see progeny of your stallion running down the racetrack. And we do cheer just as hard for them as what we do for ones that are our own. And so to have a stallion that you can do that with, I don't know, everybody don't own them, because it's just so cool to be able to cheer on that many horses.
But to circle back, I don't think any of them have ever been as exciting as Lily T won in the Derby.
I'm going to mention a little bit about stallions and about the Florida breeders, how they do embrace first-year stallions. And so I think that also bodes well for success because they can find value in those stallions and believe in them and kind of be the early adopters, right, to those stallions. So Mr. Prospector comes to mind. And there are a few other stallions that started here, move on to Kentucky and other places for much larger stud fees. And so I have to say it's a testament to you and many other folks that breed Florida stallions that when those stallions start to have success, they're able to find some ways to maybe keep those stallions here and continue that legacy. You want to speak a little bit about that?
Decision to pinhook a stallion, which is basically what you're doing. He does it a little bit. People get their tongue over the bit and want to buy him. You sell him right then. You've put, from my perspective, you've put 3 years into this horse at this point. And he's going to produce income for you, whether you sell him, right now, or whether you keep him and stand him at stud, if he's a good horse. So, I'm not saying we wouldn't sell a stallion because obviously there's going to be financial pressure at some point if a horse is doing really, really good. But I'm never anxious to do it. I feel like the people that breed to him down here should have the opportunity to continue to breed to him as long as it's financially feasible.
That you're right, there's an economic decision at some point that has to be made. But when you weigh all of that, you can say, I don't have to move that quickly. Like you said, get over your skis, sit back a little and see if you say maybe, I've got some house mares that I have, or maybe some clients that it's worthwhile to keep them here as long as that price point will work in the marketplace, and then give them opportunity to breed some more Florida Sire Stakes horses, if you will.
When we got Wildcat Air, I was in a meeting because he belonged to Windstar Farm and TaylorMade along with New Farm. New Farm owned half, and the other half was owned by TaylorMade and Windstar, but they had control of the horse, where they was going to go. And so we were discussing in one of those conference rooms at Keeneland. It was Bill Kasner, who was with Windstar at the time, and Doug Cawthon, and Ben Taylor, and Duncan Taylor, and myself, and Doug says,
you mentioned Steve. I think of my Teen Beat Heartthrob from 1978 on Affirmed, Florida bred, by the way.
This is his younger brother.
Yes, Doug.
so Doug says, well, if we stand him up here at Windstar, he said, we'll stand him for 12.5, and he'll breed 100 mares. And so I said, well, if we stand him at Cloverleaf, which is where we retired him to, I said, I'd stand him for 8,500, and he'll breed 175 mares. And they all looked at me like, well, is he crazy or is he a liar? And so at that point, I sicked Frank Taylor on Doug, because Frank's very persuasive when he wants to be, and Frank talked him into doing it. And we did breed 175 mares that year at 8,500 a pop, and that's the crop that came up with 39 winners in his first crop. So, you got to have confidence in what you're doing. Now, I've had some swing and misses. I really don't want to talk about them so much, but
we'll just leave that on that we're crazy like a fox, and we'll figure those out later. So is there anything you want to add before we close out? I really appreciate you both being guests, but it's kind of weird interviewing you because I feel like you're friends. You're some of the first people
are friends.
when
Absolutely.
we came up here that was the thing, is when I see you walk in the room, I think of friendship first, and then all these amazing stories related to it. And I'm glad to have been a little bit a part of that history, which has been really fun.
Well, the one thing I say whenever I get an opportunity is every dollar we have and everything we've accomplished was done because of Florida Thoroughbreds. So the Florida Thoroughbred industry, and by extension the Florida Thoroughbred Breeders and Owners Association, is incredibly important to us.
If you've enjoyed our podcast, please give us a review and follow and subscribe to us on all popular podcast platforms and YouTube.